Okay, so let's turn the conversation a little bit to the topic of foreign exchange. And Sola, can you talk a little bit about the foreign exchange challenge and what can be done to mitigate it?
Thank you. It's no secret that I think that's the single biggest challenge we have of attracting investment flows into the continent. And I think one perception that I need to clear quickly is it really isn't a lack of liquidity. It is just a case of pricing interference. And what do I mean? Because on the continent, the issue of the value of the local currency has become, or has in the past been, a political issue between the ruling class and the citizens. We've seen a lot of interference of the political class into the monetary policies around foreign exchange. So where you find certain governments want to keep the currency at a certain level, which it doesn't work, and I think this talks to the point I made in the past where some African countries have made missteps in terms of their policy management. But on the bright side, we're beginning to see more awareness by regulators and governments around the reality of the value of your currency. In the past, we used to have a naive view that if the currency is weak, it means the economy is also weak, but which is not always the case. In fact, you find situations where it's actually in the interest of the country to allow the currency to be weak. And this education, this change of mindset is slowly creeping in. It's slowly creeping in. And I think what could be done to change this is, rather than use fiat and political considerations to manage the currency, more better ways could be achieved. So central banks could resort more to interventions in terms of where they want the value of the currency to be. This used to happen in the past, and don't ask me why it stopped. We also feel macroprudential policies, working with MIDA, working with USAID, are things that are topical with the regulators. Even as we speak, Standard Bank is looking to put together a forum of central bank governors. And these are some of the topics we want to talk about, which is how do you manage the currency and also face the reality of what the value of your currency is. So rather than chase the symptom, focus on the real issues around the value of your currency. And I think it's just down to a lot of education. But on the other side, and this is a conversation I have frequently with the regulators, is that they have a short window of opportunity to start to do the right thing. Because what we're seeing now is that with the growth of technology, that arm of the regulator to try and keep things very, very local and try to, put fences around who does what, that power is beginning to weaken significantly. And the warning I always pass to them is, if you don't do the right thing, the market will find itself outside your ambits, which is what we're beginning to see in some African countries, where some 20, 30 years ago, you could say 80 to 90% of the currency was traded domestically. So basically, you want to invest in Africa, you go into that market. But we're beginning to see now that in some of the countries, close to 40% of FX turnover is done outside the ambit of the local regulator, which is a case of you have two foreign investors or two foreign companies who have similar needs. And rather than go into the country where you have all sorts of rules and regulations that are in conflict with each other, people are beginning to just develop their own markets outside that. And one of two things will happen. Either the regulator starts to do the right things, or the government starts to do the right things using traditional means to manage the currency, or the market will leave the regulator and a free and fair, easily identified markets would happen outside the shores of that African country. But I'm confident that with the education, with the experience in the past. One good example is Angola, where for many years they held on to a certain rate for their currency, but with certain changes, they've now opened up the regulations around the currency. And the 4 or 5 years of illiquidity they saw at that time, it's like forgotten. Nobody even remembers that Angola had an FX issue some years ago. And we're beginning to see that. Zambia is also a good example. In fact, it's a very good example from perspective of the challenges they are facing are far higher than some of the challenges some other African countries are facing. Yet they've held firm to a market-determined exchange rate. And I think those lessons are beginning to seep in slowly. I think what we all here need to do is just, anytime you have those conversations with regulators, just bring up the topic, let them realize that what they think they're saving is a very small part compared to what they're actually losing by not making it transparent and easy for investors to come in. But I'm confident that those changes are coming in. And I think over time, we'll start to see a more transparent exchange rate regime across the African countries.
Now, you mentioned Southern Africa and also Angola. Can you just talk a little bit about what's going on in Francophone West Africa and how their currency is pegged to the euro and perhaps what could be happening there?
Okay, so in Francophone, the positive about Francophone Africa is that you don't have the FX challenges you traditionally have in the non-Francophone countries. And this is simply because the currency is pegged to the euro. The reserves are, although this is controversial, some parts sit in Europe, some sit on the continent. However, the key thing there and the main difference is just the macroprudential policies. That is the main difference between the two, which is their traditional means in which the currency is being managed, and that temptation to resort to fiat or political considerations are not there because it's a collective of people. And I think that you raise actually a good point, because part of the reason why the temptation doesn't happen there is because if you are a collective of 8 to 7 countries, for example, and you have common monetary policy guidelines, it's difficult for one country to make a decision because it affects the others. Again, maybe that's the way forward for some of the other Anglophone countries, because I know in West Africa, the Anglophone countries are looking at joining together to form an economic union and a single currency. I think that will be the biggest benefit of having that happen.
Great. Thanks so much, Solo. That was a great discussion.